We are in Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4, and we're going to finish out this study. It won't take us just a few minutes to do this, and then we will turn over to our new study this morning. But Ruth chapter 4, pick up with me in verse 13, and you remember what happened last week. They were in the midst of the court, and Boaz asked the court there at the city gates to hold him accountable. And they told him that they would be his witness, they would be his accountability as he pressed forward in finishing the duties of which he had spoken in this particular scene. And we pick up in verse 13 as these duties continue, and it reads this way. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife, and when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. Boaz and Ruth were married, and in the time the Lord blessed them with a son. Look at verse 14. And the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thy old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. I believe as you finish the book of Ruth and you get down toward the end, verses 14 and 15 are the peak of this book. Ruth, who had been through great disaster, through a famine of which moved her from her homeland, away from her home folks, to a new land in the land of Moab, which took the life of her husband and the life of her 2 sons and left her bitter. To a point that we now find her and the other women of Israel are saying, the Lord has never left you. Though life has been hard, it's interesting here in this particular scene. The Lord has not left thee this day without a kinsman. He's never been away from you. And I love the scenes of the daughter-in-law, and thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee. Now notice this depiction. Which is better to thee than 7 sons she hath borne. What an indication of this ending chapter as it concludes and shows us in this particular scene. But notice 16 and 17 as well. And Naomi took the child and laid it on her bosom and became nurse to it. And the woman of her neighbors gave it a saying, there is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed, and he is the father of Jesse and the father of David. Here's where we need to recognize something as we hit this last section, especially verses 18 through 22, which you will be able to go home and read on your own time. This entire book is pointing to something incredible. Why is David mentioned at the end of verse 17? The ancestry line of Christ. Where did that come from? Think about this for a minute. Where did the ancestry line of Christ come from? God, number one, yes. But get specific. Well, that's who it's going to be. Ruth and Boaz. Look at what's happening here. That's what this book is about. Yes, it's about great tragedy, and yes, this book can help us understand that life in tragedy does not have to be a life of tragedy. But out of the tragedy found in the book of Ruth, what comes forth? Christ. The seed line of Christ. And I love the scenes found in this particular scene. Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. Here's the scenes, and you're going to make down into verses 18 through 22 and see the generations of names that are taking place here till you finally end the last word of the book of Ruth, where Jesse brings forth David. What an interesting scene to the end of a book that starts with tragedy, and listen to how the book ends. Tragedy to triumph. Because what's coming out of David? We've mentioned it multiple times this morning. Christ. From tragedy to triumph is the book of Ruth. Probably would have never guessed that as you start that book out, but that's how it ends. I'm glad we spent time studying the book of Ruth. and spent time in this particular book, there was a specific reason I wanted to pick some of these books in the Old Testament to study. There's so much there, isn't there? A lot going on. Matter of fact, I like to look at the Old Testament as our history, the history of Christianity. This is where it all comes from. And look at the book of Ruth. These people that were living dealt with the same tragedies we deal with, don't they? They sure did. The loss of a husband, the loss of children, the changing of things in time. Oh yes, they dealt with everything we dealt with. They dealt with being in a different nation than they ever knew. The nations dealt with dealing with people who were considered immigrant people. There's nothing that's different. The one key theme that will continue to show up in every book in the Old Testament is that God's people must be God's people. I think that's a theme that's in the Old Testament. God's people must be God's people. Same theme today, isn't it? We must belong to God, and we must stand by Him. Turn over to the book of Esther. The book of Esther. Let's move just a little bit. And let's pick up in this book. This is an absolutely wonderful book. The book of Esther is a very significant book, especially when thinking about biblical history, because the same thing taking place in the book of Ruth is going to take place in the book of Esther, because out of the book of Esther also is going to come the Christ. Because inside of the book of Esther, there is an individual who wants to put God's people to death. He wants to extinguish them from the earth. What's his name? Haman. Haman. Matter of fact, what's the end result of Haman? He was hung on the gallows he built for Mordecai. But this book is significantly important to us because there is a deliverance in this book that saves God's people from utter destruction, and thus is a part of our history. Thus we serve a God who can save His people from great devastation. Esther shows us also how the Jews were delivered from death and reveals the importance of this book. We're also going to see the Feast of Purim beginning inside of this deliberation. Now, this particular book is taking place in the land of Persia. That's the place, that's the reign of people we're talking about. And we're going to talk about the kings of this book at very small portions inside of this book. But here's what we know about Persia. In the time we're looking at them in this book, they were powerful. And they were on a quest for world domination. Persia wanted to rule the world. And matter of fact, as you look at history for a good portion of time, they ruled a large part of this particular world. We're looking at a time around when Esther became queen of about 487 BC, give or take some time. Let's get some background to the book just for a moment. It'll help us understand a few things that are happening. God's people are in captivity, and they had been conquered by the Babylonians, which resulted in the slaughter or deportation of a major portion of God's people. They were a much smaller people now. There were 3 separate invasions that took place or carrying aways in 606, 597, and 586 BC. Beginning in 536, after Babylon had been conquered by the Medes and Persians, the Jews were permitted to return to their homeland. And Ezra and Nehemiah provide details about this particular restoration taking place. At the time of Esther, there were many Jews or many people still in the land of captivity. And these are those who had returned to Palestine, were indeed intended for destruction inside of the details of this book. As we think about the book, just pick up with me in verse 1 and let's start. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 120 provinces. We start out this book by talking about the man who is in reign, the man who is in rule. And what we notice as we pick up, and I want you to see this in verse 1, he is in a vast reign. He controls a great amount of territory and a great amount of provinces. There was a feast taking place, and I want you to pick up with me in verse 2, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan in the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces, being before him, verse 4, finish out, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many ways, even 180 days. What's this king showing us here in verses 1 through 4? What was he showing all his princes and all his magistrates and all his royalty? The power of wealth. That's where this book is starting. Power. Not only does it have to do with wealth, it has to do with his reign. He was a very powerful man. And what he said, what he decreed, was law. And I love the scenes of what he's done here to help us understand what's happening in this book. He throws this feast, and it's not just one day. It's not just 2 days, but it's a long space of time in which he takes to show his dominance over the world. That's what he's doing. And he spends time. Well, we're looking at this particular area. India to Ethiopia, it's a large area, a very large area. We can still find these areas pretty well centered on the map in scenes. But he shows his majesty in 180 days. He spends all of this time of 180 days throwing this great feast, this great occasion. And notice what happens in verses 5 through 9. This is some introductory matters to the book. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and to small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords, fine linen and purple, to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and the royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man his pleasure. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to Ahasuerus. What's happening now? 180 days of feasting has ended. What's he doing now? 7 days of feasting for all the people. You think about that for a minute. What would it take just to feed the city of Pulaski, Tennessee? Population of approximately 7,700. What would it take to feed everybody? 7 days. It'd be a big old load of, you're right. Yes, it would have been. It would have been. It would have been. And what's interesting about that particular idea is happening here is that's usually how the world looks at it, isn't it? That's usually how the world reacts. But just imagine what power and what wealth the king had for all areas to bring these people in from the highest to the lowest and feed them for 7 days. He really was. And at the end of the day, that's something that has to be considered. He was making sure his kingdom loved him. In other words, he did just enough to make them feel special that they would stand by him. And thus the king ruled for the days in which he spent time in. I really do think it is. I think it was a literal for that first feasting there, and I think the latter feasting of 7 days was a literal day. I think he's showing his dominance over the world. And that's why I'm so glad the book of Esther starts this way, to help us get in this mindset. This is this king we're talking about. Go back and look at the kings of Persia in history and see how much power they actually had. We have a hard time with that because we have a president. And don't let me downplay the power of the President of the United States, but he is not a world-dominating power, is he? Where does he have power? In the United States. We're talking about a king here who had worldly power. We don't quite grasp that idea. How great I am. That was the sayings of the king. And matter of fact, if you'll study the kings of Persia, matter of fact, even the kings of other worldly nations of the time period we're looking at here, you will begin to notice that it was all about them. Matter of fact, go to Egypt. Who was Pharaoh to the people? He was a king, but who else was he to the people? What did he declare he was? A god. It's interestingly enough, if you look at history, that's also how many times the kings of Persia looked at themselves. They were gods to the people. And thus I think this is literally a 180-day feasting day for all the noblemen, all the controllers of all this province, and I believe it's a literal 7 days for these people here. There's nothing to indicate to me, at least in my study, and I'm not a professional at looking at the days inside of these things, but there's nothing to indicate to me that it wasn't literal. So here he's showing his power, but not only is he showing his power, who else is showing her power? Verse 9. Queen Vashti. Now, we need to understand something, and Willard has mentioned this. This 7-day depiction here is a party of drunkenness. It was all about what they wanted to do, and even you'll notice the drinking was according to the law. In verse 8, for so the king had appointed to all the office of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Whatever happened, happened. There was no restrictions in this 7 days. It was a world scene. But also remember, Vashti, the queen, at the same time, she's throwing a party for all the ladies. But in verse 10, something's going to happen. This is going to help us see the mindset of the king. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Now pause for a minute. What kind of wine is this? The best. Yeah, that's exactly how it's described. The king's wine. But what was the effect of this wine? You remember in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the Hebrew and the Greek, that there is no word that defines an alcoholic wine versus a non-alcoholic wine. So what is the context of this wine? That's where you have to go to find the context of it. Alcoholic wine. That's my declaration. It had to be. But here's what it's happening here. So we see he is merry with himself in wine, and he commanded some individuals that served him in this particular verse to do some things and to bring some people to him. Verse 11, it says, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people, the princes, her beauty, for she was fair to look on. What do we know about Vashti? She's pretty. Very eloquent way to say it here in verse 11. She was fair to look upon. Okay, what's the king want? He wants to show her off. In his, not for either of them, it didn't. It's not going to work. I think we see a principle being laid down of what's happening here in the opening scenes of chapter 1. Who is the king? What's his life? Is he like Boaz? Or we just left Boaz. Was Boaz a man of integrity? Is the king here a man of integrity? No. I will suggest to you that any man who shows off his wife is not a man of integrity. And that's what he's wanting to do. Bring the crown royal. Let's make a show of this. But verse 12, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore the king was wroth, and his anger burned in him. Is it wrong to be angry? Be angry and sin not. It's not wrong to be angry. When does anger become a sin? When we act on it or lose it. So here the king in his anger, what's he do? We haven't read that far yet, but we get the idea, don't we? It's boiled up in him, and now he acts. That's the scenes of what's happening in this particular scene. He asked his queen to come in and to show herself for him and for those that were in the room. And she would not do it. Matter of fact, something interesting about Vashti, her name literally means beautiful woman. Beautiful woman. Her name means beautiful woman. Yes, sweetheart also, yes. She was ordained by the king to do this, but she would not do. Now, there's something that's interesting here, would be my guess. Now, this is just simple conjecture. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, and we can still be friends. I would suggest that she knew he was an angry man when she decided not to go.
It was her privilege.
And technically, I think he was trying to make it his privilege. I do too. I believe she knew what she was doing. Sometimes you've got to stand up and make the right decision, even though it's going to hurt you. We're learning a principal trait here of her. I think that was the issue for her. It was the displaying of herself before other men and not her king.
Which means she did not want attention.
Yes. Yes. There's something we need to illustrate here, and I think it's fair to say at this point. But she knew who her king was just as much as husbands and wives know who their husbands and wives are. Did she make the wrong decision?
I don't think so.
Time will tell.
Time is going to tell. Time is going to tell. Should she have done it? Her husband commanded her, remember.
You know, Jonathan, I've often wondered why the book wasn't after her rather than Esther.
I know, I have too, because that's where it all begins. It all begins. But it's interesting to me that everything has to begin somewhere, doesn't it? And sometimes we're not the ones to carry the plan all the way out. Yes, I believe 100% you're right. This is a book about providence. This is a book about God. I'll get to this in just a second. Is God mentioned in this book by name? Okay.
There was a writer during the 400 BC by the name of Herodotus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He wrote the history of the Persian War, and it's from his writing that we get much of the information we need to know about the book of Esther.
Yes. And also Josephus wrote, and he wrote a document called the Targum. And in that document, he said, according to the royal decree, that she was to appear before the men with only the royal crown. You understand what that means? Nude. Get the picture? This is the society that we're talking about. Now, pause for a minute. Just pause. Is that different than the world we live? Not much. Now, I'm with you with not much. But does our world look at the physical form and elevate it to something that is to be seen in public or to be seen in a room? Are there buildings in our country where things such as the king has requested of his queen that happen every day? Yes. They're in this community. Our world has for a long time placed a high value on physical pleasure. That was his king. Now he takes it to a new height because he has all his royals with him and he wants a show for them. It's not much different than some parts of our world. So we need to recognize something here. There's an account, there's a story being told here where we can make great application. So she refuses, she won't come with the chamberlains of which we were told were to come, and he was very angry, and thus picks us up in verses 13. Read with me 13 through 15 to get the idea, and we'll see this account beginning to unfold. Then the king said to the wise men, pause for just a minute. How are they wise men? You ever considered that? How are they wise men? Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for so the king's manner toward all that knew the law and judgment. And he mentions some names in this particular scene and some 7 provinces in verse 14. It says, which the king's face in which sat the first kingdom. What shall we do to the queen Vashti according to the law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? What's the question being asked by the wise men? What are we going to do with this woman? What are we going to do with this person who will not follow the law? Where did law come from in Persia? The mouth of the king. Don't forget this. The mouth of the king. All he had to do was speak. We don't need to miss that, because that's going to play important to us later when we get into the scenes of the book of Esther. Because, yes, they were. Yes, they were. A president's cabinet. Now, what is the condition of the king? What is his mental status? Angry, yes. There's one more. Drunken. Drunken. So here he is under strong influence of something, and he's making an action, a decree about the queen. And all of these things begin to take place in this particular section. What should happen to the queen? Let's ask this question before we move on. What should happen to her? We have to admire her. I want us to see that. I don't want us to miss Vashti, because we're going to stop talking about her very soon. And she's going to fade out, and someone else is going to take her place. Yes, I think she very would have, because of what's happening in verse 12 down to verse 16. I think she had to have known, but she would have known the law. And she would have known when the king spoke, he meant business. He's going to control his kingdom. Yes, you're dead on with this. So she's in a dilemma of sorts. I would call it a great dilemma. And I'll go ahead and say it out loud. She made the right decision. There are times where we must not obey our world when it comes to obeying God. Now, I don't think she was a godly woman, but I think she was a wise woman. We found the wise men, the cabinet. I think she was the wise person. She recognized the drunken state, and she wasn't going to be a part of it.
I'd say she was trying to protect her own body.
I do too. I think that's a very, very good point there. It's very possible that she was in the society that she lived in. So here this man, verse 16, answers and says before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Verse 17, for this deed the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes. When it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought before him, but she came not. Now, pick up verse 18 and let's catch it. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall arise too much contempt and wrath. What are the men of Persia worried about? The queen did it. All the women of the province are going to rebel against the men. What does that tell us about the society that we're looking at? What does that tell us about society? I don't think it just has to do with rebellion. I think it has to do with the men were just like the king. A people are going to be like their leader. And the leader of Persia was not a good leader. Now, he knew how to rule. He knew how to overtake the world. But he knew how to live like the world, and he knew how to set the example for the world. And thus the husbands, we won't be able to tell our wives to do these things either. There'll be contempt and wrath.
Do you suppose he would think all these thoughts if he was sober?
Well, if you look at the history of Persia and some of the societies that existed, it's very possible that he might think this sober. It's also very possible that he wouldn't. I don't really have a way to answer that. Just as the same way, if we were drunken right now, we would be in a different state. The whole point of drunkenness is to alter the mental state, to alter the thinking ability, to change the way reality looks into the mind. Could he have thought differently? Maybe. Could he have thought the same? Maybe. I'll tell you where I lean. I lean to the fact that he probably would have thought the same way. Because that's the history of Persia. It was a very sexual society. It was a very visual society. I would call it a very sickening society in the way they treated certain things. And this scene is not some of the first things you would see in Persia of this matter.
He was embarrassed in front of the other.
Exactly. That was also part of this too. He was embarrassed that she wouldn't do what he said. So there's so many different things happening in this particular scene. You think he'd be embarrassed of his own self, but he's not. So we've read down to verse 18. Pick up in verse 19. Here this man is responding to the king, having this conversation, most likely drunken at the same time. And verse 19, if it pleased the king, pause for a minute. That's not going to go well, is it? That's not going to go well. Let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes that it be not altered. Now pause for a minute. The law is going to come from the king, but who's giving him the law? Somebody else. That tells us something. You may be the smallest of the small or the greatest of the great, and you will be influenced by someone. That's the introductory matter to this book. Here's what he says. Don't let this be altered. Vashti come no more before the king, Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. King, why don't you make it a law that your wife be replaced? That's the essence of that law, isn't it? And why don't you make it that she can never come in your presence again? Where did that idea come from? The wise men. Remember who we're talking about? This is the king's cabinet, per se, we would call it in today's land. And verse 20 says, and when the king's decree which he shall make be published throughout his empire, or all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give their husbands honor, both to great and small. Let's not just think about you, king, let's think about me, this wise man of the king is saying. And let's think about the greatest of the small. Let's think about the men. And let's think about how they are portrayed in this scene. Now hit verse 21. This is the conclusion of this section. And the saying well pleased the king and princes, for the king did according to the word of this man. What? Now you think about that for just a minute. What has just happened? The king is thrown, this is chapter 1 in overview. The king has thrown a 180-day feast for all the great of the community, all the great of his provinces. He's thrown a 7-day feast for the entire community, and it was a feast of drunkenness, 7 straight days. The queen, Vashti, if you'll notice in the beginning, she made a feast for the women. Now, we don't know what this feast looked like. It seems that it may have been more modest in its size, more modest in its appeal. But she threw a feast for her lady friends of the community. And the king has a bright idea on the 7th day. He wants to show off his queen, and she wouldn't do it. And he gets angry and listens to unwise men. That's chapter 1 of Esther. But we still have a passage to read in chapter 1 so we can see it. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, that it should be published according to the language of every people. Verse 22 gives us another scene of the kingdom of this king. it was not just one language. His kingdom was so vast. His kingdom was so large. His kingdom was filled with so much grandeur in space of people that he had to have official kingly translators to send this message throughout all the places in which he ruled. It begins chapter 1 with the power of the king. It ends chapter 1 with the power of bad decisions of a powerful king. Now you think about that. That's the introduction to this book. But notice as we enter into chapter 2, where we see ourselves in this particular scene. I want you just to notice something in verse 1. After these things, the royal decree has been sent out. She's been put away from his midst. The wrath of the king was appeased. He remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Notice verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. What do you think verse 1 means? He remembered Vashti and the decree that was against her. What do you think that means? He sobered up, and what did he recognize? It seems to me that now that he's had some time, now that she's out of his presence, and now that he remembered her, what does it seem? It seems like he misses her, doesn't he? But what does he know? He's made a royal decree. And that's something even the king can't change. She's out of his presence. She is gone. Now it seems to have also altered his state, because verse 2 we read, those that helped the king, those that worked with him daily, said, let's cheer you up. That's the essence of what they're saying.
It's quite possible while he was drunk and said this, said that, then he sobers up. Like some drunks that I've been around in my lifetime, you're like two different people. When he sobered up, he don't remember what he said.
It's very possible. Very possible. But here's what we know. He remembered her. And that's where we're going to end our class. The bell is rung. But I want you to, before next week, not before next week, because we've got a gospel meeting coming up. So we will not be in this class next week. We will have all of our classes next week in the auditorium. But be reading for 2 weeks. Just kind of read a little bit about chapter 2 and try to find some things in chapter 2, because we're going to pick up with the king and his people helping him. They're going to bring in a bunch of these ladies for a new queen to be selected. And we're going to have to start seeing in this particular scene how God is going to save his people. And that's where we'll pick up next in 2 weeks. Thank you.